Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our continuing study, more of a Hebrew word study, getting a little bit deeper into the Hebrew. And as you remember, we are going through First Samuel, and we're in chapter 18, and taking verse by verse here. And we pick up on verse 14 of this chapter today. And some very fascinating things. There's a these few verses here just have a lot of meaning to me personally, spiritually. And so we're going to look at verse 14. And as we get a little bit more comfortable to read the Hebrew, it goes, Vayachi David lechal derachav mashkil la Yahweh imo. So basically, it's saying that David behaved himself wisely, and we've seen this word before. We've unpacked it, the maskil of behaving wisely. But to me, this just speaks volumes that this was noticed, because David didn't write this. This was written about David, and of course, it doesn't do much good for us to pat our own selves upon the back. That's very vain and very shallow. But when you have others speak well of you, when you have others compliment you, and you have a spirit of humility, as we're going to see that David had, this is where life really takes on meaning, and where the quality of life and a person's ability to feel that they're fulfilling God's will on this earth really pulls it all together. At least it does, as I desire, and would love to have this said about me, as I'm sure all of you listening would love to have this said about you, that in everything we do, that the Lord was with us, that Yahweh, again, it's significant to me that this is the Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, at least majority times thought that it's pronounced Yahweh, but the important part here is that it conveys the merciful and compassionate side of God. And even though David was fighting battles and fighting against all the enemies, which you would think would fit more into the Elohim category of being victorious and conqueror and having those mighty attributes, it's interesting here that the people didn't ascribe those qualities to David. They ascribed the qualities of compassion, benevolence, and kindness to him. And again, that's just beautiful. And I love that verse. And so, the people were favorable towards him. The people loved him. Let's see what King Saul thought about all this. So as we go to verse 15, we see something very, very interesting. And let's try to read the Hebrew here again. It's Vayar Shaul Asher Hu Maskil. There you see that word maskil again. Me'od. So that's pretty much standard, but the people saw him behaving wisely, but now Saul is seeing him behave wisely. And you would think, to a normal rational person or common rational person, this would be a great thing. You got somebody who behaves themselves wisely, you could trust him, he's reliable, he's going to be loyal to you. But look at the effect that it has on Saul. And this is an interesting word here. It says Vayagar Mipanav. And so Mipanav, we talked about last week, is from the face of. Panav is face or presence. So instead of Saul being in love with David and happy, it says here that he was afraid. You're going to look at different translations. You're going to find many different, a few different things. The Hebrew translation of what's called the JPS, or the Jewish Biblical Publishing Society, excuse me, have this that Saul stood in awe of David. But here it shows Vayagar, and it's translated as he was afraid. Obviously, we can look ahead and see the rest of the story and know that Saul was not favorable towards David anymore. But what was he feeling? What is Vayagar? So in order to look at the tools we have at our disposal, we're going to unpack this, and it comes up with the root word of Gimel, Vav, and Resh, or Gur, as it's pointed with the vowels. Again, the original Hebrew text did not have any vowel pointings, which can be sometimes a aid when we are doing studying that don't maybe the vowel pointings will lead you in one direction, but you do have the ability to change some of those vowels and look at it differently to see if it possibly helps you to understand this verse. So we see this gur um, comes up with to sojourn. Okay, well, that does not look like that meets the criteria of fear or stand in awe of. So what does it mean to sojourn? So what we did is there is a publication called the Dictionary of the Targumim, Talmud, and Midrashic Literature by Marcus Jastrow, a noted biblical scholar. And so because the Aramaic is somewhat of the mother or sister language, depends on which Bible scholar you want to talk to, they're tied together, put it that way. And we can learn from that and find some of the root meaning. So when we go to Jastrow's here, we see the Gur says to move around, to be a stranger. Um, that's an interesting term. And I think that fits very, very well here if we look at this verse and say that, but Saul became a stranger to him, that he was wary of him, and maybe not wary in the sense that, he was always looking at him suspiciously, but he kept his space. He saw that the Lord was with him. Saul knew that the Lord was no longer with him. Saul noticed that the people were in favor and supportive of David. Saul knew he had lost the favor of the people. And so he had separated himself. He had reclused himself and was not in the same place where David was. Maybe he was afraid of what he would do. Maybe he was concerned that he would have, we know that he's prone to fits of depression, outbursts, and we're going to see that intensifies. And maybe this was a place where he started to see that he was not able to control his emotions and that he was not behaving in a way that he was proud of. And so he tried to stay away from David. And so that's a very interesting way to look at this verse. And then we go on to verse 16. Obviously, the whole opposite thing here is V'chal Yisrael v'Huda. So all of Israel and Judah. Remember, they were somewhat fragmented here. They started out as one united nation, country, but then through the time of the judges and things that happened prior to the time of kings that we're coming into now, they were separated, and that David would be able to bring these two nations together. And you see some of that happening here, the fact that both of them loved, Israel and Judah loved, or ohev, et David. Now, what's also interesting here is the word David is very much closely associated with the word to love, or hav, or ohev here is saying to love. And when you look at David, his name is tied in many other places. It comes from the root word of Dod, and the term Dodi is a term of endearment in Hebrew that you would call your loved one, like if you'd say sweetie or honey, or a pet name for your loved one, you would call them your Dodi. And in fact, you even see some women that have the name of Dodi, and that's where it comes from. It's a beloved one, and it's based upon the root of the name of David. And if you do any Bible study in Hebrew in the book of Song of Songs, or sometimes called Song of Solomon in the English Bible, Song of Songs. In the Hebrew Bible, you'll find that Dodi is used throughout the Song of Songs to express love in many different ways. And so I think it's interesting that the word of David and loved is very closely associated. And why did they love him? It was kihu yotzei veba lifnehem. And so, because he went out and came in, and remember, Leaf Nahum, even though it's translated as before them, it's really in the face of, in the presence of. He had a face-to-face relationship. He maintained close relationship with the people. He was a people person. He loved people. He loved interacting with them. They saw he was genuine. They saw God's favor upon him. They saw that he behaved himself in a way that they immediately loved him and respected him and cherished him. And so he went out and came in. Everybody saw him. He was not one thing in closed quarters and a different thing out in public arena. They knew who he was, and he's just winning their hearts and gaining the favor. And you would think this would be such a great thing, and Saul would use it to help solidify the kingdom, but we see quite the opposite begins to happen in verse 17. And the Hebrew goes, Vayomer Shaul el David. So Saul said to David, Hine viti um, Hagedolah. Here's my older daughter, and her name is Merab, and Ota eten lecha leisha. I will give her to be a wife to you. And then he says, there's a condition here. Ach hiye li liven chayil. Only be a valiant man, and vehilachem milchamot, fight my battles. And then, of course, he tacks on there of Yahweh, and tries to get God involved here because he knows David's desire is to serve God. And again, very interesting that Saul uses the word Yahweh and not Elohim. And this is a trap. This is just something Saul's trying to um, deviously get David out of the way. But what is interesting is when before David slew Goliath, he had asked, what will the king give to the person who vanquishes this foe? And he said, oh, he'll get his daughter. Well, you would have thought that would have happened directly after they got done with the battle, that this would have taken place. But here it seems Saul withheld this. He wasn't a man of his word. He was always looking for some opportunity only to better himself. And again, this poor daughter, Merab, gets stuck in the middle, and whether she liked it or not, she was going to be given to him as a wife. And again, we don't know how old David was. Um, of course, our traditions sometimes show him as just a small boy, 12, 13 years old. Well, he's not ready to get, you know, married yet. Others say that he's not that young. It's a little confusing to sort our way through, or even how much time went on here from the time of slaying Goliath until we get to this point right here. Um, I know there's some estimates that can be made based upon how much time Saul was actually king, and the time before David became king. But again, the time here is not what's critical to the biblical text. What's critical here is to show the characters of these two people. The whole again, we as Westerners tend to be very literal and critical, looking for minute details and dissecting things to say things that are not there. And when I study with my Hebrew teacher, he stops me all the time as we go through these words, and he goes, "You Christians are always so literal. You just take it." So literally, where in the Hebrew mindset, they look at what is the story trying to tell? what is the moral of the story? They're not so concerned about whether one word says one thing and means another, or sorting through all the frivolity, or that's not the right word, but all of the meanings of these words, the minute detail of these words and unpacking them. They're looking at what's really happening here, saying the kingdom's being set up and Saul's being disposed and David's taken over. That's the moral of the story. And that's why this happened. It shows you what kind of guy Saul was and what kind of guy David was. And that's the reason these words are here. So again, very different mindset of studying the scriptures between Jewish people and Christians as to how we look at the Word of God. And so we see here that the purpose is being laid out, and we're going to probably stop here at the end of verse 17 as we finish reading it. Is Shaul Amar thought, or that's also the word for said. Amar is to say in his heart. Tehi yadi bo uthi boyad uh, Palish Philistine. So really his purpose is let's send him out to battle, let him get killed by the enemy. My hands will be clean of this. I don't have to worry about it, and he'll be out of the way, and I can retain the kingdom. And no one will know that I hated this guy. So that's basically what Saul is saying here in verse 17. So I hope you enjoyed this study of the Word of God, focusing on the things that are meaningful as being a man after God's own heart and walking wisely before God, and letting the people all around you seeing that you have a relationship with God and that you love him and are loved by him. So God bless you all, and see you next week. Bye-bye.